Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Shabazz Dar, and today my session is going to be on identity management. Before I get started, just want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors for the Scottish Summit. These type of events are obviously very difficult to put together, and they made much easier with sponsors like so. Thank you to ScriptRunner, DQ Global, Proximo 3, Redspire, Gilassist, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and also Hitachi Solutions. So a little bit about me. For those who don't know me, my name is Shabazz Dar. I'm a senior infrastructure consultant at Netcompany, who are a Danish company, but I'm based in the UK. My main areas of focus are Windows Virtual Desktop, Endpoint Manager, and Azure. I've been doing public speaking now for really regularly for the last 6 months. I'm a keen blogger. I have my own blog site, imitgeek.com, which is also what my YouTube channel is. I do weekly content on various subjects around cloud. For those who are watching, please share on social media using the hashtag Scottish Summit 2021. So yeah, my presentation is going to be based around Azure Identity Management. So in my experience, there are 3 areas that are available to us when it comes to identity management in Azure. So we have, first of all, we have Azure Active Directory, which is the more cloud native identity management. We then have hybrid identity management, which is obviously a mixture of both on-premises and cloud. And the final one is Azure Active Directory Domain Services, which is more of a domain controller as a service, which is cloud hosted. So these are the 3 areas that I'm going to go into greater detail about. And also be doing some short little demos. Hopefully the demo gods will be on my side today. So we'll get straight away started. Azure Active Directory is the first section that I'm going to be going to discuss. So what I'll discuss is, what is Azure Active Directory? We'll go through some of the license requirements. And then, like any service, there are always pros and cons. So I'll go into what, in my opinion, what are the pros and cons of the Active Directory Azure service. So, what is Azure Active Directory, first of all? It's a service which integrates, it's a cloud-based service, as I mentioned before, it integrates with Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and also Microsoft Teams, just to name a few of the services. Like most Azure cloud services, Azure Active Directory, or Azure AD for short, has sort of different levels of features, all dependent on the subscription you assign the user. You can secure Azure AD Cloud only authentication using multi-factor authentication. You can also assign Intune policies to Azure AD user accounts for compliance and configuration on not just Windows 10 devices that are enrolled, but also hybrid joined devices and also Android, iOS, or macOS devices. So just to touch on what the sort of licensing, different types of licensing you can get. So there's four levels of Azure AD licensing. First is Azure AD Basic. So this provides users or groups management. You can get self-service password change for cloud users only with the free version. You can also get single sign-on capabilities in Azure for Office 365 and certain third-party SaaS apps. You can also have integration with on-premises Active Directory, but this will be discussed further on when I discuss the hybrid section. We then have Azure AD Premium 1, or P1 for short. So this has all the same features and capabilities of the free version, but has more support for hybrid users, some advanced administration, including dynamic groups, and also you can get cloud password write-back capabilities as well. Moving on to Azure AD Premium 2, or P2 for short. So this has, again, all the same features and capabilities of the Premium 1 license, but also Premium 2 offers Active Directory identity protection to help provide like risk-based conditional access to your applications and your kind of critical company data. Final type of license I've experienced is it's like a pay-as-you-go feature license. So these are additional feature licenses such as Active Directory business to customer or B2C, which basically helps provide identity and access management solutions for customers, for customer-facing applications. So this is like a specific use case. You get these sort of this feature license. Just to move on to some of the pros, in my opinion, of Azure AD. So it's highly available by architecture, and it's designed, it's spread across multiple data centers in different geographic locations. It is consisted of independent building blocks to provide scale and availability. It's a centralized administration, kind of a single pane of glass of users and groups through different locations. So whereas on an Active Directory on premises, you have it broken down into different OUs and OUs within OUs, etc. With Azure AD, it's all one pane of glass. So it doesn't matter which country you're residing or which office, you're all available in the same sort of management suite. With one identity, you can access thousands of SaaS applications, so that single sign-on. And on-premises applications, you can achieve single sign-on on your on-premises applications using pass-through authentication or federation. But again, that's something I'm going to discuss shortly in the hybrid section. Finally, Azure AD provides rich security and activity reporting. In my experience, I've always found it difficult to get really decent reports through Active Directory on premises. I've had a very good experience with Azure Active Directory, where you can easily and quickly get granular reports for when you do have some sort of security breach. It's easy to find and report on what caused it. So, every service has good points and bad points. So I just want to touch on the few, what I believe are the few cons. So the no integration with on-premises applications unless they support SAML or they require further configuration and resources. And again, I'm talking about sort of ADFS. And that's where ADFS is a prime example of need more sort of resources. Similar, and again, I'll discuss more detail around that in the hybrid section coming up shortly. In my opinion, it has a massive reliance on Microsoft 365. So any outage to Microsoft 365, can cause a lot of issues. I think last year there were a couple of major incidents where Active Directory did actually have some issues, and people weren't able, users weren't able to access their Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, OneDrive, Teams, and it caused havoc with so many, of the cloud-based applications. So that, to be fair, I struggled to find any cons in it because, in my opinion, it's such a great cloud identity management platform. So, but that was one of them that I eked out. What I'd quickly like to do is just quickly, so that's the Azure Active Directory sort of section. Now, before I move on to the hybrid identity management area, I just want to do a quick bit of a overview of Azure AD in the actual Azure control panel. I'm just going to share my screen if it lets me. There we go. So this is my sort of demo tenant. And what I just want to go is I just want to go to Azure Active Directory just to give you a quick overview of the portal and some of the options we have around there. So on the front page, like the dashboard, you have kind of some information around sign-ins and some very basic information. You can customize your dashboard and you can put more information in there if you wanted. Here, this is what I mentioned around the sort of single pane of glass. As you can see, I've got, these are all I've only got a few users. I've got some test users for the demos that I do for my YouTube channel. But again, it doesn't matter which location the users are in, you can see them all here. And again, this is for if you delete any users, you can find them in here for a short amount of time. And again, it explains there that users are permanently deleted automatically 30 days after they are deleted. So you do have a 30-day grace period to kind of get users back. Again, here you've got password reset options that you can, again, text into the further menu here, and you could do more properties and options around password reset. Go back a screen. I mentioned the reporting and the auditing, and again, down here, as we see in activity, there's a section where you can look at sign-ins, audit logs, and like bulk operation results. What we will notice shortly is every sort of menu has an activities area where you can do separate reporting. Let's go back into here, look at some of the other settings here we've got where we can manage groups, external identities. So this was more this is kind of the B2C stuff I mentioned, and also having external identities with like Google, Facebook, and those sort of vendors. So it allows us to do more external collaboration. We've also got enterprise applications here. So this is more the integration with other third-party SaaS applications. So obviously we've got the sort of Microsoft ones here, like Exchange Online, etc. But you can go to all applications. I'm hoping that loads. Yeah, so we've got, again, a whole load of different, again, these are the Microsoft ones at the moment. We've got a whole load of different sort of applications you can do integration with, application proxies, etc. This is, again, I'm going to be touching on the Azure AD Connect option later on in the presentation, so I won't touch on that yet. The other one I want to just quickly go through is the security one. So we mentioned MFA, I think we've mentioned conditional access as well. And this is essentially where you can configure all that. Your conditional access policies to increase security around your identity management. We can also look at your identity score here. So this tells us more information around how secure is our tenant. Shockingly enough, mine's 23 out of 203. That's quite embarrassing. I've shown that live. So moving on, named locations. So you can add these sort of named locations which will be used by your Azure AD security reports to reduce false positives. So again, another really good utility service to manage there. And this is like your authentication methods for your multi-factor authentication. So we've got your hardware security key, your mobile app, text message, and your temporary access pass, which I think is quite new. There's obviously, you've got risk reporting here again, which is another really good feature. I said there's many more monitoring down here, which I mentioned earlier. There's many more features there, but I won't go into any of them because what we'll do is we'll move on to the hybrid area. So that's just been an overview of what the actual Azure AD portal looks like and some of the options you've got around it. I'll go back to sharing my slide. Perfect, thank you. So let's move on to the hybrid identity management. So this is the second type of identity management in Azure that I've experienced. So hybrid identity is where you have an Active Directory domain controller on premises on a Windows server, and you also have Azure AD in the cloud, and you use a tool called Azure AD Sync to synchronize objects from your on-premises to your cloud. So there are three main ways in which you can set up the hybrid identity, all via Azure AD Sync tool. So we've got, and again, I'm going to be covering all these shortly. So we've got password hash, and then I'll discuss some of the pros and cons of password hash. We have pass-through authentication, or PTA, and I'll go through some of the pros and cons of that. Finally, we've got federated ADFS, which is also supported with Azure AD Sync, and I'll go through some pros and cons of that as well. So starting off with password hash. So how does the sync work, first of all? So Azure AD Connect synchronizes a hash of the hash of a user's password from your on-premises Active Directory instance to your cloud-based Azure AD instance, or tenant, I suppose is a better word. So your Active Directory on-premises, it stores passwords in the form of hash value representation of the actual user's password. and to synchronize your password, Azure AD connects, syncs an extract of your password hash from on-premises Active Directory instance up to your Azure AD tenant. So it's the passwords are synchronized on a per user basis and in chronological order. And you've got extra security in the processing. It's applied to the password hash before it's synchronized to the actual Azure AD authentication service. So kind of in transit that security to make sure it's protected. Some of the pros and cons now. So first pro is it's scalable and very resilient, since this is all native Azure AD with no reliance during authentication. And it provides breach replay protection reports of leaked credentials, since the stored hash can be used to compare against credentials found on the dark web, as it's called. One of the cons, and this is one of my kind of bugbears with password hash, is it's got kind of a backdoor, you could call it. So if Active Directory, if your Active Directory account has a locked or restricted hours set or password is expired, it will not impact the ability to log on via Azure AD. So it's Active Directory on premises that controls your identity object. So again, to give you an example, the synchronization is normally done by default every 30 minutes or so. So if you change your password on premises, it doesn't update Azure AD for another 30 minutes. So within that time period, you can actually access Azure AD with your old password. Or if you get locked out, it will update for another 30 minutes. So for me, that's a bit of a backdoor and a concern, which is, I feel is a con or a negative of password hash. So moving on to pass-through authentication. So this allows users to sign in to both on-premises and cloud-based applications using the same password. You can combine pass-through or PTA with single sign-on features. So when users are accessing applications on their corporate machines inside the network, they don't need to type in the password; it'll just auto log in. So Outlook is a prime example of that. Or if you use OneDrive, etc., you can configure it with PTA and single sign-on. So just again, a few pros and cons of pass-through authentication. So again, it's a cloud scale and resilient, since all the native Azure AD, and it's got no resilience during authentication again. And again, it's got restrictions enforced. Sorry, it's lighter than Federation as well. So you have some of the features of ADFS, but it's not like fully blown ADFS. So it's a lighter than Federation. There's restrictions enforced. So whereas with pass-through authentication, it had that backdoor kind of that I mentioned. You don't have that with pass-through authentication. So that any restrictions that you enforce on premises are kind of enforced in the cloud as well, pretty much straight away. One of the negatives is the kind of legacy authentication support that it still has with it. But I believe so. Obviously, when I did this presentation a while ago, this was a con or a negative. I believe since then, now obviously Microsoft are doing the modern authentication, which I suppose does remove this negative aspect. But I think correct me if I'm wrong, but there might still be some legacy authentication supported. But moving to modern authentication will sort this. So the final hybrid element I want to discuss is federated ADFS. Now, ADFS has been around for a while, obviously, and before the Cloud Sync, Azure AD Cloud Sync, this is kind of federated was the only way to do the sort of single sign-on and sync between on-premises and Microsoft Cloud. So it's a collection of domains essentially that have established a trust. The levels of trust may vary, however, but typically it includes authentication and authorization. You can federate your on-premises environment with Azure AD, and you use this federation for authentication and authorization, as I mentioned. The signing method it ensures that all users authenticate, and the authentication, occurs on premises. So again, there's a big reliance on your on premises resources. This method of authentication also allows administrators to implement more rigorous levels of password control. And again, they're all managed through your Active Directory on premises, but this has got more rigorous levels of access control than the password hash and the pass-through authentication. So again, some pros and cons, and you probably notice there's a few more cons, a few more negatives than the other two. So some of the positives around it is it supports more third-party MFA and custom policy and claim rules. And also it's cert-based authentication, which is, in my opinion, is a more robust method of authentication than what pass-through has and what PTA has. Sorry, PTA and password hash have, sorry. Some of the negatives around it, there's a large amount of infrastructure required on premises. So you need an ADFS server on premises. You need an ADFS proxy server. Again, the bigger your requirement, the more of those you have. So you may have a farm where you have multiple servers based. So it can be difficult to scale. You need to have firewall exceptions in place as well because it's on premises. And I mentioned just then that it's got limited scalability, which in my opinion is a negative around it, because it'll just cost more. The bigger it gets, the more it'll cost. Whereas the other two are probably more cost effective. So I'm quickly, again, just going to spend a few minutes. I've got a pre-configured sort of Azure AD Connect or Azure AD Sync set up, which I just want to go through some of the settings in the wizard. So I'm just going to quickly share that. We've still got plenty of time. Again, so far the demo gods have been pleasant to me. So this is a virtual machine that I've got on my on-premises demo lab, so to speak. So we've got Azure AD Connect already configured. So I'm just going to launch it. So obviously welcome, and it just gives you the option to configure it. And what we have here, we have the different settings we can actually look at configuring or at least view. So privacy settings, I'm not going to go into each one, but here you have to kind of, I'll just quickly authenticate to show you the options it has here. Oh, that's embarrassing. It's like the demo gods are not shining on me. Let's look at the here we go. Okay, so we'll look at this. This basically shows you what existing configuration you've got in place already. It seems to be struggling with my authentication, so I won't be able to go into the other settings at the moment. This is what I get for doing a live demo. As you can see here, it's got your Azure AD ID sort of information, the name of the, so this is one I use, there's a demo tenant I use for work. So this is the name of the directory, the account, the MS Sol account that we use. And again, it's got information around the synchronization settings. So, we're using the UPN to sync. Device write back is currently disabled. And what you can essentially do is you can actually export these settings as well. And further down, I'll go back to some of the tasks in a minute, but we've got group write back disabled as well. As you can see here, I'm using password hash synchronization. Password write back and user write back are disabled. And again, just goes into some of the SQL instance details there as well. If I just go to previous, again, we can customize the synchronization options. So here I could actually amend those options. It's probably going to not authenticate, so I won't show you that. We can do hybrid device options as well, but that is obviously out of scope of this presentation. But we can change the user sign-in. Here we can manage the federation. So this is the ADFS settings. I don't have these configured. This is a really good tool in my, this is part of it. So you can actually troubleshoot. You can actually launch a troubleshooter and it launches if you've got any problems synchronizing. It'll help you work through what could be the problem. It's like, again, a similar sort of wizard, and it gives you tips on what sort of possible solutions and links to any articles that may help you troubleshooting. So this has helped me a lot in the past. So that's a really good tool there. So yep, I am going to stop that one now. I was hoping that would go a bit better, but it didn't, no problem. Go back to my presentation. So the final part of my presentation is around Azure Active Directory domain services. So in this section, I'm going to cover, what is Azure AD domain services? How does Azure AD domain services work, or Azure AD DS, as I call it for short? And I'll go through some of the features of Azure AD domain services. And again, I just want to go through a quick demo of what it looks like in the tenant. Again, I've already got very much Blue Peter style. For those who know Blue Peter, I've got something I prepared earlier. So I'll just show that in the tenant so we can have an overview of what sort of settings you have there. So let's get stuck into it. So what is Azure AD domain services, or Azure AD DS? So Azure Active Directory Domain Services provides managed domain services such as domain join, group policy, lightweight access control protocol, or LDAP, and also Kerberos and NTLM authentication. So very, if not identical to what you get with an on-premises domain controller. You use these domain services without the need to deploy and manage and patch a domain controller in the cloud. So, if you think about it traditionally, if you wanted to join a Windows 10 device or a server to the domain, you'd have to do it to a domain controller on premises, or one hosted in Azure on a VM. This is actually a kind of a service, like a SaaS, which is a domain controller as a service. So you don't need to provision those. So it takes the headache of having to manage and maintain that virtual machine or physical server on premises away. So how does it work? So to provide the identity services, Azure creates an AD domain service managed domain on your virtual network of your choice. So it's essentially like you would put a virtual machine on a VNet on a subnet. It's the same premise. This instance of Azure AD domain services you deploy to a managed virtual network within Azure. And Azure AD domain services integrates with your existing Azure AD tenant. So you've got your managed domain in Azure AD. You've already got that there. Essentially, when you provision this, that synchronizes with Azure AD. So it integrates with your existing, it lets your users sign into services and applications connected to the managed domain, i.e. virtual machines. So Windows Virtual Desktop is a prime example of something that uses your managed domain services domain. You can also use existing groups and user accounts to secure access to resources. So these features provide like a smoother lift and shift for on-premises resources to Azure. So I've already touched on some of the features, just go into a bit more detail. So domain join. So unlike with Azure AD, which anyway you can't, because it's password hash, you can't join Windows devices like Windows 10 or Server OS to Azure AD. But you can join them to your Azure AD domain services domain, as long as the devices can access that subnet the Azure AD domain services instance sits on. So an example is if you have some Windows 10 devices you want to join to it, you have to have that VPN set up so your on-premises can talk to your Azure AD VNet, so that virtual gateway. It's highly available. So Azure AD domain services includes multiple domain controllers, which I'll show you that in shortly. And these provide the high availability for your managed domain. And then this high availability obviously guarantees service uptime and resilience to failures. As mentioned, it integrates with Azure AD, so your user accounts, your group membership, and credentials are automatically available from your Azure AD tenant. I suppose it's not a caveat, but one thing just to keep in mind is when that sync happens, you actually have to do a conversion of your Azure AD accounts and your passwords to Azure AD domain service. Because if you think about it, Azure AD stores your passwords as password hashes, whereas Azure AD domain services is going back to sort of the Kerberos or NTLM sort of authentication. The way you do that conversion is by getting users to change their password. And only once they've changed their password does that convert it, the account and the password, so they can start accessing the resources managed by your AD domain services instance within Azure. So just something to keep in mind. That tripped me up very much at the start when I was sort of started managing Azure AD domain services. So yeah, new users groups or changes to attributes from Azure AD tenant or your on-premises Azure Active Directory domain services environment are all automatically synced. So with the on-premises bit, it's a bit different, whereas your on-premises AD syncs with Azure AD through the Azure AD Connect tool that we looked at earlier. So that takes about 30 minutes, or you can force it. And then once that's synchronized with Azure AD, that automatically then instantly syncs it with Azure AD domain services. So it's almost like a chain, but the Azure AD is very vital to that chain. And we've mentioned again another feature is the Kerberos and the NTLM support and the authentication. So you can deploy applications that rely on Windows integrated authentication. So if for whatever strange reason, if you wanted to deploy an Exchange, a fully blown Exchange server, you could do that, and you could join it to your Azure AD domain services tenant instance rather than housing it on premises. So that's the end of my slides. I just want to quickly do, go into a quick, it's just not really a demo, I suppose, but it's just an overview of what Azure AD domain services look like in the portal. So just bear with me, Eine Minute. There we go. So this is, like I said, this is one I prepared earlier. This is part of my my work demo tenant that I have. So this is already pre-provisioned. So this is the sort of when you type in Azure AD domain service at the top here, it then takes you to this sort of screen, and you can see if you had any other domains here. So here you can see what resource group it's in, the location. And if we go in here, first overview shows you sort of, I guess a bit like your dashboard. Excuse me. If we just click on view health, that kind of shows us when it was last backed up, because you get it's automatically backed up as well. As part of the service, and you don't need to worry or manage about that. So it was 1349 UTC, and it was synchronized. That was Tuesday. That was backed up, and then it was synchronized about 10 minutes ago, which is really good. I've got no alerts or anything like that. So all healthy. And here, then again, it's got some. You can change your SKU if you wanted to. And again, it's got some. It gives you some documentation. I mentioned about, the instructions on what cloud users need to do to synchronize with Azure AD domain services, and also what synced user accounts need to do. So it gives you some really good links and documentation around that. You've got your standard sort of activity log and your access control, where you can give different sort of groups or users access to domain services depending on what their role is. It's all the sort of role-based access control which is supported. So I'll go down to properties. So I mentioned, so it's again the forest type is a user one, which is sort of the standard one. I mentioned about having to sit on a network. So this sits on my VNet 01, and it sits in this subnet. And that's the sort of security group that it's assigned to. But these two IP addresses are essentially in the back end, what Microsoft manage. These are the two domain controllers that are managed by. So this is the sort of HA that I mentioned. You've got two domain controllers with these IP addresses, but we don't, as the administrators, we don't see these VMs, so to speak, or backend resources are managed by Microsoft. But these are two. And what you actually need to do is, if you want your resources that you put on this VNet, which I'll go into in a second, if you want those resources to be able to pick up your Azure AD domain services instance, you need to make sure that your DNS of your VNet is set to these two IP addresses. So that's something to note. Again, just some other, again, the admin group that can manage it, some other information around there. This is where I can enable secure LDAP, which I mentioned as one of the features. It's not enabled by default, but if I wanted to enable it for those applications that require sort of LDAP, you can enable it here. I won't do that for this instance. Again, this is some information around the synchronization. And again, I can synchronize all users, or I can scope it if I want just certain groups or members. So again, I've gone just for all my users. Again, we'll go back to the sort of health that we can see on the first screen. And these are where we can kind of look at notifications. And who do we want to choose who should get emails and alerts as and when there's an issue. Again, more sort of monitoring, diagnostics, logs, and workbooks here, which is kind of standard of Azure, I suppose. Every sort of service seems to have its own monitoring, troubleshooting, and more diagnostics down there. So that's kind of, and one thing to note is that when you do provision this, it does take quite a while. So I think I've done a video on Azure Identity Management for part of my YouTube channel. I think it took an hour to provision the tenant instance, and then it took another hour for it to actually be available for me to look at these instances. So you're looking at 2 hours in total to provision it. So for anyone who is going to do that, just keep an eye and mind that it can take up to 2 hours. So I'll just go back to my presentation just to finish off. So that is my presentation done. Finished a few minutes beforehand, which is I suppose good timing. So I just want to say a massive thank you to the organisers of the Scottish Summit. Massive honour of mine and a privilege to be accepted to present. It's only my second ever conference. I was lucky enough to present at the WBD Tech Fest earlier this week, but I really appreciate the support they've given throughout this process with the slide deck and all the advice they've given me around the presentation. Thank you to them, thank you to the sponsors, and thank you everyone who's watched. I really appreciate it. So if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer.